Hello, my name is Aneet Narendranath. I am a senior lecturer in mechanical engineering from Michigan Technological University. In my presentation, I'll demonstrate how specific enthalpy of steam can be approximated using neural networks. Morning, and thank you for joining me for my presentation, which is Approximating Steam Properties, Machine Learning on the IAPWS standard. The title field did not allow more than these many characters, which is why it was so abbreviated. Just so that you know, the IAPWS is the International Association of Properties of Water and Steam. They are actually an international standards organization that publish the properties of water for a living, right? And steam, obviously. So that's what my presentation is generally about. So let me briefly talk about what I'm doing and where I'm from, who I am. I am a senior lecturer in mechanical engineering, engineering mechanics at Michigan Technological University from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That's the part of the United States that's left out in a lot of maps sometimes, or coupled with Wisconsin for whatever reason. So I had to find a map that shows that as a separate entity as part of Michigan. It's a very beautiful place, and these two images that you see of our seasons are just 2 days apart. Not really, but they are two seasons that, so the season on the left-hand side, the summer, is very, very short. It's June, July-ish, let's just say that. We tackle about 300 to 325 inches of snow every year, and barely do we ever have cancellations of school, maybe twice in the last 13 years. So it's actually a fantastic place to be if you're into technology and if you wish to either study or work at a top-class university. Honestly. So this really is a machine learning opportunity in traditional thermodynamics pedagogy, right? Thermodynamics teaching. What I'm not going to do here is revolutionize how we use steam tables. No, it's a perfectly fantastic way as to how to use steam tables that we have right now. I'm not revolutionizing that necessarily. You could consider that to be the case depending on your use case. But primarily, the opportunity from my point of view that I'm uncovering since I teach thermodynamics is how can I roll machine learning into an engineering thermodynamics course, right, without too much effort, so that mechanical engineering students who are predominantly from a non-machine learning background, right? So mechanical engineering students, when they exit this course, they understand more than just the vocabulary of machine learning and neural networks. So what I have in this image is there is a decision tree approach, if you will, on how you triangulate or interpolate the properties of steam, right? You need to first know the state of steam in terms of either the temperature and pressure, temperature and quality, or whatever it is. Essentially, we need two properties of state. And from there, we make a decision on where exactly are we. Are we saturated liquid, saturated vapor, superheated, and so on, and consult a table using that kind of a decision tree and extract properties. That's the classical way. That's the canonical approach of steam tables in thermodynamics, right? And that's fantastic. What the Mathematica neural networks and the advanced, or rather the automated machine learning framework allows is for introducing machine learning into the habitat of mechanical engineering thermodynamics. So if I'm able to introduce machine learning into the habitat of mechanical engineering thermodynamics, I have a much better chance, a lower activation energy, if you will, of having students understand what machine learning is, in a sense, demystify machine learning and neural networks for non-computing students mostly. Right? Because no doubt there exist a lot of examples, you know, the CFAR, CFAR 10, the NIST, MNIST rather, handwritten digits and so on. Fantastic examples for neural networks, classification, what have you, but they are not in the appropriate habitat, if you will, for mechanical engineering students. So this is my effort to bring that into our curriculum. One of the many examples. So what I'm trying to do here is to use the automated machine learning function predict and the neural network function nettrain to approximate the specific enthalpy of steam. To do that, I train my neural network specifically on the highly accurate data that is available from the International Association of Properties of Water and Steam, right? And this plot over here is pretty much the pressure temperature diagram as defined by the IAPWS, right? What is interesting about this plot is the standard that they have published sequences thermodynamic data, particularly Gibbs and Helmholtz free energy functions, I think what they are, into 5 major zones based on what your temperature and pressure tuples, if you will, are. Now, based on which zone, or based on the zone that you are in, or the state of steam is in, you could have an equation of state for that particular region, for G or F or H and so on. And from that equation of state, you perform, on that equation of state rather, you perform certain numerical calculations to calculate a specific enthalpy or a specific internal energy or a specific entropy and so on. So honestly, the data set from the IAPWS is pretty astounding. It is indeed a multi-dimensional data set, but I am only focused on the mapping of pressure temperature to enthalpy. So it is a very small subset of that whole data set. So a data sample, if you will, is what I'm considering, right? Just so that it is amenable for a lecture and a half in thermodynamics to get the point across as to what exactly is machine learning, what is neural networks, right? So that's the general idea. So what I will do first is a roadmap of the approximations that I perform in this demo. Predominantly, I'm using the predict automatic machine learning function as my baseline, because it's a very easy way to get into all this demystification process. And then I move to a heuristic perceptron neural network, HPNN. I train this on the full data set that is available to me, or rather the subset as I was talking about, a single isobar of steam. And then I also train my neural network on the 5, or rather the 4 zones that are clearly available from the standard. And lots of comparisons are made of one type of approximation, which is predict, versus the other type of approximation, which is the neural network. So predominantly, or actually you could consider this to be a regression kind of a problem, really, right? There is some sort of a classification thrown in, but that comes with the problem. You're classifying or clustering specific enthalpy into 5 different pockets per the standard. So there is that. Right, so let me get my data into the notebook. Okay, that too. Yes, and I am considering a data sample, if you will, which is organized into 4 columns. Column 1 is my temperature in degrees Celsius. Column 2 is my pressure in bar. Column 3 is the region specification. It goes through 1, 2, 3, and 5. Region 4 is a very thin slit, if you will, and I don't have enough data density in this example to capture region 4. And finally, column 4 is the specific enthalpy of steam in kilojoule per kilogram. So there are 3 more zeros that you'd have to append to that, or 10 to the 3rd multiplier. So those are my columns of data. And what is interesting is that the data really, you could perform a k-means clustering of the data, and that's what it really looks like. There is a sequencing of the data set into 4 zones using k-means, if you specify 4 zones. I artificially specified 4 zones so as to have qualitative similarity with the actual data sequencing per the standard. So really, if I were to look at the IAPWS clustering, the standard defined clustering of data versus my k-means clustering, there is some qualitative similarity. A key feature of the standard, the industrial standard, is there is a fold in this data. If you notice, the green portion of the data has some sort of a logistic sigmoid fold, spoiler alert. Essentially, that allows me to switch between different layers of a neural network to better capture that particular transition, if you will, right? So that is the clustering of my data set. What I'll get started with is dividing this data set, the whole data set, which has all the regions, or all the zones as I call them, all temperatures, pressures, and specific enthalpy, TP to H mapping. I divide that into 75% and 25% portions. The 75% portion is pretty much my training set, if you will, and the 25% portion is my validation set. The only reason I chose a 75-25 division is because it seemed to work best for this particular problem. I use a gradient boosted tree in the automatic function predict because that seems to be the fastest, particularly in light of a presentation time that you usually have. So let me try to run through this. Takes a few seconds, clearly, if you haven't opened this in a different notebook. So we'll have at least one or two more strategic pauses such as this when things are cranking, and I will talk about the general ideas behind this particular pedagogic example and this particular pedagogic exercise that I'm running, why and how. I'd like a few more slides to go forth so that our general understanding of this problem evolves. So after I finish the gradient boosted decision tree predict operation, I look just to see what the worst predictions are, just to see if this is a worrying aspect. Sometimes it is. And then I look at my error, percentage error with respect to the validation data. It's pretty bad. Really, it is pretty bad. I mean, if I have a percentage error more than 2 or 3%, I should really be annoyed with this whole process because, yeah, it's a bad percentage error. But keep in mind that the point here is not to create a neural network tool that approximates specific enthalpies yet. That could definitely be the case, needs some more refinement. But it is more about students understanding what machine learning is and using certain critical thinking skills to compare approximations with standards and so on, right? So that's one thing. I find what is interesting is that the worst predictions are along the band of phase change. So that's good to know, because if I'm trying to calculate phase changes or perhaps design a turbine or something that works through a phase change process, I should be really aware that I have some error in my approximation. So that's good to know. This is, again, a pretty good exercise to know where your error exactly is situated. So that's good. So what I will look at now is using what my little predict function did. I will solve a canonical problem. The state of steam at the entrance and exit of a reversible adiabatic turbine is provided. The entrance condition is superheated steam, while the exit condition, if I remember correctly, 100 C and 100 kPa is saturated vapor, I think. And I actually perform this calculation of how much work is produced by this turbine per second, if you will, or per unit mass of steam. I find that it's 1,585 kilojoule per kilogram from the machine learning prediction, right? If I were to use that to calculate the work produced by a turbine. But the actual prediction is 590, the actual value rather, from the standard, from the data available is 519. So there is about thrice the error, so there is an overestimation of the predict object. Right? So we need to make this better, definitely. We need to certainly make this better. So one thought came to my mind that to make this better, why not partition this data that we have into isobars, lines of constant pressure? Because instead of dumping all the data at my predict object, let me dump just a single isobar and see how that makes a difference. So that is exactly what I went about doing. Oh, sorry. There you go. That's 1, 2. Very quick, because an isobar has about a tenth of the data available for the entire data set. And I find that there is really not much of a difference, I think, were I to use an isobar, just a single isobar, with respect to using my predict object on the full data set. So I thought initially that may be an advantage, using a single isobar, dividing my data into isobars and performing my prediction, but clearly that was not so much of a great thing. So what I do next is I train now a heuristic perceptron on the isobar. And when I train my heuristic perceptron on the isobar, heuristic, so all the layers were chosen by trial and error, really. It's a pretty quick process. Right? It's a pretty quick process. And when I look at my error for my predict object, which is automated machine learning, versus the neural network or the heuristic perceptron on the isobar, qualitatively, I would say there is not much of a difference. I would obviously need to solve many problems to see what kind of an impact my heuristic perceptron did. So at the point, both have deficiencies is what I would say. That's all I would say and go on. There are other questions that need to be asked, such as, would a greater density of data help? I would think yes. I would certainly think yes. It's something I can consider for the future. I also have a data set, or rather the perceptron, training on the complete data set, right? So let me run this. This is the one that will take a little long, so I will talk over it as this process happens. Or maybe it won't take that long. My computer seems to be much slower at home. So essentially, I went about introducing this idea into an undergraduate course in thermodynamics. Keep in mind, these are undergraduate students, first, second years mostly. And the questions I posed to them before this exercise is, do you understand what machine learning is and what neural networks are? Very small sample size. I had, I think, 8 students here, so please bear that in mind. Very small sample size. 6 out of those 8 students talked about neural networks being what's in Google. That's what helps you, give you good search results and so on. Keep in mind, these are very young mechanical engineering undergraduate students, right? At the end of this exercise, they had a much greater understanding that neural networks can be used to approximate properties of steam. Now, going from a very broad, hand-wavy understanding of what machine learning and neural networks are within a single lecture period, an example such as this could provide them with a certain more mature direction. So that's a win in my case, because such examples do help. They certainly help. I find that when I train my perceptron on a single isobar versus, or rather on the entire data versus a single isobar, the single isobar definitely performs better. All these percentage errors bars, the more number of bars you have, the worse your approximation is, really is what it means. So there seems to be some merit in dividing my data into isobars, but it's not very useful, because what is the discretization in isobars that I would need? It's pretty painful, right? So what I set out to do is, instead of me discretizing my data set into isobars, lines of constant pressure, I use the IAPWS standard and divide my data into 5 zones. 4 zones in this case, just because of data discretization issues. And I find that when I start training my neural network on each of these zones, the error decreases much more. For instance, I have 2 plots over here. There is no reason to run the whole simulation again over here. 2 plots. The first plot is the perceptron trained on zone 1 as per the standard. And the second plot at the bottom is the predict object, which was my baseline. I could already tell that by clustering my data into thermodynamic zones as per an industrial standard, I was able to approximate specific enthalpy of steam far better than training some sort of an algorithm on all the data that's available to me. So clustering does make a difference. So that's a good thing, right? I do the same thing with each of the regions. Region 2, I think, performs spectacularly well. In fact, I think it was almost 1 or 2% was the error. Since the error bar, rather the error plot, starts at 5%, it's a blank plot. So yeah, clustering of data into zone 2 and applying the same perceptron to it was a good thing. Zone 3 was an issue. Remember, if you can, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about zone 3 having this logistic sigmoid kind of a curve. That was not properly captured through the use of some sort of a nonlinear hyperbolic tangent layer in my neural network, right? So obviously, I didn't go into what all the layers are. But zone 3 was not the best prediction as compared to my baseline, which was my predict object. So zone 3 was certainly lagging over there. So there's something that I need to improve with zone 3. Did the same thing with zone 5. Zone 1, 2, 3, and 5 were what I was looking at. Zone 5 was pretty fantastic, but so was the baseline predict object. So what I did was, I have 4 zones of data, 4 clusters of data. Each of the clusters of data, a neural network was trained on it to approximate the specific enthalpy of steam. 3 out of the 4 zones, 3 out of the 4 clusters were pretty good, 1 to 5% error. As a pedagogic example, that's pretty good. One of the zones, I think zone 3, 10% error or so. That's not very good. It's really not very good. Again, if you are a student, you start understanding what kind of a rule of thumb I'm using. Okay, 10% error is pretty bad because I have a pretty accurate standard if I have to go make measurements with. So why use a neural network? You see, that's an important realization in itself. But nevertheless, from an academic perspective, it was important for me to try and improve the predictions or my approximation in zone 3, which had this fold. That's the green zone over here at the center, and it has a fold. And what's the best way of actually improving or changing my neural network for someone who's a user of neural networks, not so much a developer? Stack more layers. This is something I learned in yesterday's neural network applications talk also. If you don't know how to fine-tune your layer, stack more layers to begin with, and then try to figure out what's going on. So that's exactly what I did. I stacked an extra layer along with switching a hyperbolic tangent layer with a logistic sigmoid layer for zone 3, which was the worst approximation. And that did seem to make a difference. I had errors for the modified zone 3 neural network much better than what I had previously. So that tells me something also. So yeah, that was a little bit of a run through, if you will. I really breezed through a lot of this material on what was being done. As a summary, not so much a conclusion, because there's quite a lot that can yet be done. As a summary, I have a baseline automated machine learning function in the Wolfram Mathematica framework, which is predict. It's a baseline. I use that as a baseline because it is the easiest to use in a classroom without getting bogged down by different kinds of layers and so on. It gets people thinking about machine learning, at least. I have a data set provided by the International Association of Properties of Water and Steam. That data set also specifies certain clusters or zones of properties of water and steam, right? So I train my predict object on the full data and a single isobar. I also have a heuristic perceptor on neural network, if you will, with 4 or 5 layers, which I train on the full data on a single isobar and each of the zones as proposed by the standard. And I made comparisons between one and the other, essentially. So yeah, that's the general idea of this particular example. The next steps really for me are to create a tool really that locates a given temperature and pressure point in a certain zone and applies that specific neural network to that particular T and P combination to find a specific enthalpy or approximate a specific enthalpy. Another interesting thing would be to actually cluster the specific enthalpy data using fine clusters in Mathematica, using k-means or something pretty simple, and compare that with the international standards definition of different zones of steam. Also to look at perhaps neural network loss plots and stop criterion, if that makes any difference to runtime, because I don't have to wait if my loss curve has plateaued, which is what I was doing in most of these cases, wait until the loss curve has plateaued. Maybe that is not necessary, right? So a few acknowledgements. The first one is, of course, the Department Chair of Mechanical Engineering at Michigan Tech, the Director of Undergraduate Studies, Dr. Jeff Allen, members of a group called Undergraduate Curriculum for Industry 4.0. This is an effort towards introducing elements such as machine learning and neural network and really distributing them or sprinkling them all across our mechanical engineering curriculum, because that's usually not done. You would have machine learning or neural network as specific courses, but if you want to reinforce these concepts with students, particularly students who come from a generally non-computing background, you need to sprinkle these examples all over the curriculum. And those examples have to be so that they fit in the framework of the curriculum, right? So the framework here, or portion of the framework here, was engineering thermodynamics, right? And a few other folks that I wish to thank. There are lots of references that I have used which are somewhat similar, but not the same, obviously, because otherwise I wouldn't be presenting this material. There have been some, there's been some other work on artificial neural networks on single equation of state kind of thermodynamic analysis. What I'm looking at is multiple equations of state. There are equations of state changing with zones in the example I have. But these these references are more of a single equation of state. There was one interesting ASEE paper that was designing of columns, similar kind of, the concept still remains. You're mapping a set of inputs to an output, right? In this case, it was the strength or the stress for a certain loading condition and so on. So that was my presentation. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.